I thought about taking a mulligan, but I don't know if I'll get away with it tonight. So turn to John chapter 9. John chapter 9 is where we're going to spend some time this evening. John chapter 9. And in all honesty, it would be nice to take a mulligan because I've spent the afternoon on the soccer field. Soccer season has started, and Olivia is playing for the first time. And I've never coached before, but the only way to get Olivia on the field was for me to coach. And so, yes, she's the baby because I got in trouble with the other two because I didn't coach them. But I really found out that in U6 soccer, it's not so much coaching as it is just ball chasing. So that's what I've done the last hour or so. And I thought about the sermon tonight in relation to that, of really what we could use. I don't think it would do any good, but we could use some referees because it can be pretty chaotic. It's important in sports to have a rule book, and it's important, of course, in games to have a referee. But the problem can be is if the referees are using a rule book that they wrote themselves. And that should cause you maybe to think about the Pharisees, because that's exactly what the Pharisees did. They were great referees of their own rule book, and they were extremely eager to throw a penalty flag at any chance they could get. And in the Gospel of John, of course, John is writing that book, as he tells us at the end of the book, so that we might believe that Jesus is the Christ and that by believing in his name, we may have life. And so all throughout the Gospel of John, John is recording these events and showing us the words of Jesus through the Holy Spirit to bring us to faith, to believe in Jesus. But then on the other hand, there's always this contrast of those who choose not to believe. And of course, the main characters on that team are the Pharisees. Even when the evidence is before them, they just completely reject it. They will not accept that Jesus is the Christ. Even when there is a clear miracle that was performed by Jesus in front of them, they'll do whatever it is that they can do to deny it. And so in John chapter 8, before we get to John chapter 9, it's really, I love the Gospel of John, and even in studying it more, I've just seen more and more of how, especially John chapter 8 through John chapter 10, how these chapters connect. And it all begins back in John chapter 8 at verse 12, where Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And he goes on to say, whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And so some of the major themes in the Gospel of John is light and darkness, or life and death. But focus on that light, that we will walk in the light and not be in darkness if we follow Jesus. And so in the very next chapter, in chapter 9, we're introduced to this man who was born blind. And so physically, he has lived in darkness his entire life. And in John chapter 9 and verse 1, it says, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And not to get into the specifics of really why they asked that question, really the thing that I want you to see is that Jesus really gets to the purpose of this man's blindness. He doesn't answer the question of the cause of this man's blindness, but the purpose of his blindness. And Jesus says in verse 3, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. In other words, here is an opportunity for God to be glorified, for God to be seen, for me to do the Father's work. And that's why he says in verse 4, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And of course, the story goes on. After Jesus says that, he spits and makes mud, and he puts the mud on this man's eyes, and he tells him to go to the pool of Siloam and wash his eyes. And that man does that. He follows the directions of Jesus. And what I want you to see, he didn't know really who Jesus was at that moment. But he simply did what Jesus told him to do, and he received his sight. So what I want to do tonight, I want to show you, and those of you who are in our class on Wednesday night, you know where I'm going with this. I want to show you the progression of this man's faith, that he went from darkness to light, and how he grew in belief. And just notice the contrast between how his belief grows, his faith grows, but then on the other hand, you've got the referees, you have the Pharisees, and in contrast, it's unbelief. They refuse to believe Jesus. So I want you to notice this and think about, first of all, just this blind man. And you think about what it would be like to live your entire life in the dark. This blind man, of course, I think he knew and experienced cruelty. I think those who are handicapped, you think about someone who is blind, maybe intentionally or even unintentionally at times are overlooked, or they're passed by, not given much attention, or they just kind of get in someone's way. And so you think about this man living that way, living his life as a beggar for his entire life. And yet Jesus comes along and he removes his blindness. And what's ironic, as I said, is that this belief grows in a crowd of unbelievers. And so I want to go to the end of the chapter in verse 35. I want you to notice in verse 35. Let me just read through the end of the chapter. Verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. Now, let me stop right there and say, what does that mean? Well, the blind man, we'll go back, but the blind man and the Pharisees, they engage in this dialogue about how he could see. They wanted to know, what do you think of Jesus? And they operate not from conclusions. Remember, they operate from preclusions. They already had their mind made up. And they say, there's no way this man can do this. The reason why they say there's no way this man can do this is because they have decided that Jesus is a sinner. Although Jesus said in John chapter 8 verse 47, which one of you can convict me of sin? And nobody said a word because they couldn't. But now, one chapter later, they're calling Jesus a sinner because according to their rule book, they've thrown a penalty. And so they come to this blind man and they're really just kind of interrogating him. And they're saying, he can't be good. But the blind man is saying, well, listen. This man, this is what he starts with. This man gave me my sight. But let me keep going. He says in verse 36, let me go back to verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, are we also blind? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, we see, your guilt remains. So quickly, I just want to show you three things tonight of how this man's faith grows. First of all, a growing faith from this blind man we see is that his initial faith resulted in persecution. His initial faith resulted in persecution. And one of the things that amazes me about this story is that Jesus gives sight to this blind man. And when you go and you read the rest of the story, like starting in verse 8, the neighbors and those who had seen before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but he's like him. He kept saying, I am the man. It's me. And what's missing throughout this entire story of what's amazing to me is that nobody stops and says, praise God. We are so thrilled for you. We want to rejoice with you in the fact that you can now see. Nobody ever does that. Of course, the Pharisees, they're all concerned about it because it was on the Sabbath. And as you read, his parents didn't rejoice because they were too afraid. They were afraid of being cast out of the synagogue. And again, the Pharisees, of course, they didn't rejoice because they couldn't give credit to Jesus for this miracle. Because if they gave credit to Jesus for this miracle, it's going to build up esteem in the eyes of people towards Jesus, and that's going to cause trouble for them. Have you ever thought about obviously there's disadvantages. I mean, we think about, the blind because they can hear the birds, but, they can't see the birds, or they can hear the wind going through the trees, but they don't see the trees. And as the blind man, he can hear the sounds of people in the temple, but he can't even see the temple. But you know what he has never seen before? He's never seen hate. He's never seen hate. Do you realize that you can see hate? I believe that when this man's eyes were open and he saw the Pharisees, that he saw clearly exactly how hate looked. He could see things like suspicion. He could see things like unbelief. He could see the anger that was burning in their eyes. He saw what little huddles of people who were suspicious looked like. And he saw what looks of disgust even looked like now. And I think about this man. His faith was new and he needed to grow. But here's what I admire so much about this man is that he was unwilling to compromise Jesus. He was unwilling to do that. He puts us to shame in view in light of our greater understanding of who Jesus is. And as I said, this man didn't even know that Jesus was the Son of God yet. To him, he was just another man. We'll see later, perhaps a prophet who had healed his eyes. And what they're saying is, you betray him, disclaim this man. But the blind man says, well, I'm not even sure who he is. But I'll say this, I was blind and now I see. And because of that, I'm going to stand behind him. I'm going to remain loyal to this guy. And so I would have to say that the beginning of his faith, the start of his faith, was quite impressive. And look what it led to. As I said in verse 35, they threw him out. Now, we might just read that and not think much about that, but he was thrown out of the temple, but that meant a lot more than just the temple. It meant that he was thrown out of society. It meant that he was thrown out economically. He was thrown out of the religious life of their community. I mean, this would destroy his life. Anyway, it's the first day he could see in the temple, and he's told, you can't come in. And so his initial faith resulted in persecution. But the second thing that I want you to see is that his increasing faith was rewarded by revelation. As his faith grew, that faith was rewarded by revelation. Now think about this for this man. He spent his entire life blind, and because of that, he was a beggar. That's all he knew. That's all he knew was to sit and just beg for alms. But now he can see. He can see, but he's cast out. He can see, how's he going to get a job? How's he going to survive? And you think about this and the joy that he would have, of course, that he can now see. But I wonder if he's thinking, boy, what should be the best day of my life has turned out to be pretty rotten. And that's why we read in verse 35 that Jesus heard that they had put him out, and finding him. It's amazing that the blind man, he doesn't go looking for trouble. Jesus, though, goes and he finds him. This is what we see throughout this story, that Jesus initiates this man's healing. We mentioned this morning about the different ways in which Jesus healed those who were blind. And yes, blind Bartimaeus cried out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." But in this story, this man said nothing. He didn't ask Jesus to have his sight restored or have his sight given. But yet Jesus came to him. Jesus took the initiative. And so while he can see now physically, he's still in the dark. He's lost. He's confused. And Jesus knows, I'm going to find this man. That's what Jesus does. Jesus had a question. He says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And notice the way that the blind man responds. Jesus says, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he said, who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? I want you to think about his response. This guy, he's just a bundle of faith that's just looking for the object of his faith. Just tell me who he is. Show me who he is, and I will believe. I don't know who the Son of Man is, but if you point him out to me, I'm going to believe. You see, it's so interesting the way in which his faith develops. In verse 11, you'll notice in John chapter 9 and verse 11, he just says, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes. And again, a little bit later, the Pharisees come up to him. And, what do you think about this man? And look in verse 17. The blind man said, he is a prophet. So he's gone from a man to a prophet. And then later the Pharisees confront him and they say to him, how can you see? The blind man said, I've already told you this. But notice what the blind man says in verse 31. In verse 31, he says, we know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So you see now he's come to the conclusion, this man's got to be from God. Do you see how his faith has grown more and more? More and more we see this. And later on, of course, his faith is going to go to that, to calling him Lord in verse 38. But before that, you see, this man is not believing just yet. And here's what I want you to see, and what I think we see throughout the Gospel of John, is that there's really two kinds of unbelief. There's two kinds of unbelief. There's the unbelief that is, first, it's not a matter of the intellect, but it's a matter of the will. It's not a matter of the intellect, it is a matter of the will. And again, this shows us, I think, the perfect illustration of what I'm saying. This man was not believing, but he wanted to. He desperately wanted to. He willed to believe. He just needed to know who to believe in. That's where his faith was. But the Pharisees, of course, it's completely different. But the blind man said, show me who the Son of Man is and I can believe it. That's the kind of faith that really complements the initiative of God. That's why I said Jesus sought this man out without the man asking. But this man shows initiative in saying, I know I need to make the choice to believe. And that complements the initiative of God. Yes, God takes the first step. God seeks us, just as Jesus said, the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. This man is saying, I know I need to choose. I know I need to will to believe in the Son of Man. Aren't you thankful? Aren't you thankful for the fact that we can say, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief, like the Father did there in Mark 9. I don't have all the answers, but Lord, just help me believe. I want to believe. And that tells us something about faith, is that faith always grows. Faith is never going to be perfect, but it needs to be willing. It needs to be willing. Notice what Jesus says. Jesus says, you have seen him in verse 37. He says, show me who he is. Jesus said, you have seen him. He's the one who is speaking to you. Can you imagine? Can you imagine on the very first, you've been in darkness your entire life, and on the very first day, you see the Son of God with your eyes. What an amazing day for this man. And this man remained loyal to Jesus, even through his persecution. And the reward for that is a full revelation of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And what I love about it, Jesus is going to be true to this man because the man was true to him. And the more you stick by Jesus, the more you follow Jesus, the more you seek Jesus, the more and more we're going to come to understand just who Jesus is. I wonder if at times where I think I just don't know if I know Jesus enough. Is it because I've not been loyal to him? Is it because I haven't chose to stick with him? Jesus is unlike any other person in this world. There's no one that compares to him. You know, the more, I'll use myself as an example, the more and more you get to know me, the more and more you realize that I'm human, right? That's the way it is with all of us. The more and more we get to know one another, the more and more we realize that we are all human and that we have imperfections and we have weaknesses. And at times, we let each other down. But here's the thing with Jesus. The more and more we get to know Jesus, the more and more we're just in wonder of him. Don't you see why he is completely different from us? And that is the reward of a growing faith. But the third thing that I want you to see in this man's belief is that his enlightened faith responded in adoration. His faith responded in adoration. And this is what I love when Jesus says, "You have seen him. It is he who is speaking to you." And he says, "Lord, I believe." And then notice what his response was. And he worshiped him. Oh, now he has spiritual sight. He has physical sight already, but now he has spiritual sight. This man's response to receiving his sight from Jesus is that he simply wants to bow before him and worship him. When it comes to our worship to God, worship is going to be a priority to us when we recognize who Jesus is. When we recognize who Jesus is and we understand the difference that Jesus has made in our lives. When we understand who Jesus is and what he has done in our life, worship is not something that we want to avoid or something that we want to just hurry up and have it over. It is something that we want to do no matter what. You can't stop someone who has been changed by Jesus and been given sight spiritually to worship, to stop worshiping him, to worship him in all of adoration. It's really just the natural thing that we can do. And look at how Jesus sums it all up. Jesus says, verse 39, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." And the Pharisees, the referees, they're standing there, and they say, "Well, you don't mean we're blind too?" And Jesus says, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say," or the NIV says, "but now that you claim we see, your guilt remains." Jesus didn't come into the world to judge the world. You think he wouldn't have had to, he could judge the world from heaven if he wanted to. Why did he come to this world? He came to this world to save the world. But in his coming, there is judgment. Why is that? Because when you are confronted with Jesus Christ, you pass judgment on yourself one way or the other. Just like we talked about this morning, you have to make a choice. That's why I say when you think about unbelief, you can describe it with two different kinds. There are those who are not believing because they're just ignorant. They don't know. But then there are those who do not believe because of their arrogance. And those who are arrogant, they say to us, if we say something about the gospel and Jesus, they say, "Oh, I don't need that. I'm doing just fine. I'm getting through life all on my own." But somebody who doesn't believe because of ignorance, their attitude is completely different. Their attitude is one of saying, "Help me believe. Instruct me. Teach me. Guide me." The eunuch said, "How can I unless someone teach me?" That's the kind of response I'm talking about. I want to be enlightened. The Apostle Paul said in Acts chapter 26, when he was going back over his conversion and that story, telling that story in Acts chapter 26 at verse 18, the Lord said to him that he's sending him to the Gentiles to open their eyes, that they may turn from darkness to light. And that's our job. That's our mission. That is our mission. You've heard me say that when Jesus says, "I am the light of the world," it's the only "I am" statement that Jesus applies to his disciples. Because remember, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, "You are the light of the world." And so we have a responsibility to take the gospel, which gives sight spiritually to those who are in darkness. It is the only answer to spiritual blindness. But again, that arrogant attitude says, I don't need help. You know why they say I don't need help? I already see. I already see. But Jesus comes along and he says, no, you claim that you see, but you don't really see. And what a danger that is for someone who thinks they can see, but they can't see. They can't see their sin because of their pride and because of their arrogance. So we have this contrast in this man's life between he and the Pharisees, receiving sight and the Pharisees choosing not to believe. And so it boils down to that question for us tonight. What will we do with Jesus? What type of attitude will we have? It could be that you're here tonight and you need to respond to the gospel call. It could be that you find yourself in a situation where, tell me more about Jesus. I want to believe. Just tell me more about him. I need to know more about him. I hope that you have that kind of attitude. There's a whole group of people here tonight that would help you with that. That will answer that for you and show you exactly who Jesus is. I pray that we don't have the attitude that says, I see just fine. I don't need anything. The answer to all of our problems, the answer to our sin is found in Jesus Christ, and he lights the way. If you need to respond to the gospel call this evening, if you need to be baptized, immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins, where you unite with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and you can have a relationship with him, why don't you let us know while we stand and sing.